Spanish Flu 1918. Viruses, Plagues and History, Past, Present and Future. Written by Oneida Powell. Narrated by Dylan Parker. Seasonal flu versus pandemic flu. Past pandemics. An influenza pandemic is a global outbreak of a new influenza A virus that is very different from current and recently circulating human seasonal influenza A viruses. Pandemics happen when a new, novel influenza A virus emerges which are able to infect people easily and spread from person to person in an efficient and sustained way. Because the virus is new to humans, very few people will have immunity against the pandemic virus, and a vaccine might not be widely available. The new virus will make a lot of people sick. How sick people get will depend on the characteristics of the virus, whether or not people have any immunity to that virus, and the health and age of the person being infected. With seasonal flu, for example, certain chronic health conditions are known to make those people more susceptible to serious flu infections. The risk factors associated with seasonal flu can be found at people at high risk of developing flu-related complications. Influenza pandemics are uncommon. Only one occurred during the 20th century. An influenza pandemic is a global outbreak of a new influenza A virus that is very different from current and recently circulating human seasonal influenza A viruses. Influenza A viruses are constantly changing, making it possible on very rare occasions for non-human influenza viruses to change in such a way that they can infect people easily and spread efficiently from person to person. Read more about pandemics in recent history. The influenza pandemic of 1918. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed more people than the Great War, known today as World War I, at somewhere between 20 and 40 million people. It has been cited as the most devastating epidemic in recorded world history. More people died of influenza in a single year than in 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague from 1347 to 1351. Known as Spanish flu or la grippe, the influenza of 1918 to 1919 was a global disaster. In the fall of 1918, the Great War in Europe was winding down and peace was on the horizon. The Americans had joined in the fight, bringing the Allies closer to victory against the Germans. Deep within the trenches, these men lived through some of the most brutal conditions of life, which it seemed could not be any worse. Then, in pockets across the globe, something erupted that seemed as benign as the common cold. The influenza of that season, however, was far more than a cold. In the 2 years that this scourge ravaged the earth, a fifth of the world's population was infected. The flu was most deadly for people aged 20 to 40. This pattern of morbidity was unusual for influenza, which is usually a killer of the elderly and young children. It infected 28% of all Americans, twice. An estimated 675,000 Americans died of influenza during the pandemic, 10 times as many as in the World War. Of the US soldiers who died in Europe, half of them fell to the influenza virus and not to the enemy. Deseret News. An estimated 43,000 servicemen mobilized for World War I died of influenza. Crosby. 1918 would go down as an unforgettable year of suffering and death, and yet of peace. As noted in the Journal of the American Medical Association, final edition of 1918 has gone. A year momentous as the termination of the most cruel war in the annals of the human race. A year which marked the end, at least for a time, of man's destruction of man. Unfortunately, a year in which developed a most fatal infectious disease, causing the death of hundreds of thousands of human beings. Medical science for 4.5 years devoted itself to putting men on the firing line and keeping them there. Now it must turn with its whole might to combating the greatest enemy of all, infectious disease. The effect of the influenza epidemic was so severe that the average lifespan in the US was depressed by 10 years. The influenza virus had a profound virulence, with a mortality rate at 2.5%, compared to the previous influenza epidemics, which were less than 0.1%. The death rate for 15 to 34-year-olds of influenza and pneumonia
Sample complete. Ready to continue?